So today I wanted to share a story with you about a famous Tibetan Lama named Geshe Ben. Now you may or may not know what a Geshe is, but the title Geshe is similar to our title PhD. It's a doctorate in metaphysics in Tibetan Buddhism. But it's much more difficult to become a Geshe than it is to get a PhD. Because in order to become a Geshe, then you have to spend at least 21 years in a monastic college. Now, it's not the case that you necessarily have to be a monk or a nun to become a Geshe, but it's going to be very difficult because basically they study in a way in which they give up all worldly concerns. So if you have any kind of life whatsoever, then it's going to be very difficult for you to get this kind of degree. Basically, all they do all year round is study, with very few holidays. And because of this, they become very learned. Now, they're not necessarily good meditation practitioners, and that sounds strange to some people. In fact, many Geshes don't meditate at all. All they do is study. But anyway, Geshe Ben was learned, and he was also a practitioner. And in those days in Tibet, then somebody like Geshe Ben probably lived far off in a mountain somewhere, in a little hermitage, a little stone house on the side of the mountain near a village. You might also be associated with one of the monasteries, but it's very common to find these practitioners in isolated areas. Now, this story of Geshe Ben is related to the practice I gave you yesterday, and that's about remaining mindful of our impulses. And also trying to project what the consequences would be if we were to just give in to our negative impulses without controlling our mind. So one of these tales that has come down in the Tibetan canon is of Geshe Ben. And one day he was doing his morning practice, doing a water torma or something like that, in his little hermitage, and suddenly he realized that today was the day that his sponsors were going to visit. Now, Geshe Ben looked around his little hut and realized what a filthy mess it was. And he thought, this isn't any good. If my sponsors come here today and they see the state of my shrine, then they'll be very disappointed in me. And so I better clean everything up. And so he went around his room, cleaning up the shrine and making everything look spick and span. And then suddenly Geshe Ben caught himself. And he realized that he was only doing this in order to impress his sponsors. And of course, he depended upon his sponsors for his livelihood. They would make offerings to him, offerings of butter, yak meat, and tea, that sort of thing. And then he chastised himself. You hypocrite! You're only cleaning up so that you can impress your sponsors and get offerings from them. And then he took a handful of ash from the fire and threw it all over his shrine. So of course, when the sponsors came, they saw everything was a complete filthy mess. Now, years later, when Padampa Sanjay heard this tale of Geshe Ben, then he put his hands in prayer position to his head and said, that was the best of all offerings that was ever made in Tibet. So we have to ask ourselves, why was that so good? Well, that's because Geshe Ben applied mindfulness. He checked himself. He was learned in the Dharma. He wasn't a beginner. He was a practitioner. He'd been doing it all his life. But still, he gave rise to negative mind poisons. And in this case, he was being a hypocrite. So really, this is didactic, right? It's trying to tell us something. And that is, we need to apply mindfulness in our everyday activities and to check ourselves, check our motivation especially. Another time, then Geshe Ben was invited to a feast. And this is something that's quite common in Buddhism. It happened at the time of the Buddha. A rich sponsor would invite the Sangha to a meal and feed them and make offerings. And so Geshe Ben was sat down at the long table, somewhere in the middle. And he saw the servant bring around a big bowl of yogurt and start ladling yogurt out to everyone's bowls. And he thought to himself, oh, The yogurt will be finished before it even gets to me, and I won't get even a drop. Again, Geshe Ben, applying mindfulness, caught himself and thought, "You greedy, selfish individual," and he turned his bowl upside down. When the server came to his position on the table, there was plenty of yogurt left, but his bowl was turned upside down. And when the server inquired if he wanted some yogurt, then Geshe Ben replied, "My greedy mind has already had its fill." And so that day, he went without yogurt. And in this way, again, he was admonishing himself for giving rise to greed, selfishness, this desire that we should go first above everyone else. Now, this is something that we are often guilty of. When chocolate and delicious food is being handed out in the holiday season, or when it's time for our staff bonuses at work, often our first impulse is to think about ourselves, and primarily to worry whether or not we are going to get our share. So what we need to do is we need to be like Geshe Ben. We need to remain mindful of our motivation and the way we're thinking. And then recognizing this, we have to apply this attentiveness to the remedy. And in this case, what Geshe Ben did was he stopped himself from getting any of that sweet yogurt. He was punishing himself for being greedy. So in the Tibetan canon, then there are many stories about Geshe Ben, and they're all very similar. There's another time Geshe Ben was invited to the home of a sponsor. That's often done in the Tibetan tradition. They're asked to come to say prayers or to give advice, and in return they're often given presents. Usually in Tibet it was food, because they really didn't have money. They just had grain and meat, and yogurt and that sort of thing. And Geshe Ben noticed in the room there was a brick of tea, and he thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a bit of that tea so I could make a cup when I went home? And then, when the sponsor was out of the room, Geshe Ben impulsively went to the bag of tea and stuck his hand in, and then realized what he was doing. He caught himself. He thought, "You terrible monk, you're going to steal his tea." And then he shouted, "Stop, stop, there's a thief in the house. Come cut his hands off." Geshe Ben was referring to himself. He had pointed out his own fault in front of his sponsors. Now, we find it hard to believe that a venerable old monk like Geshe Ben could be so bad, that he would want to steal from his sponsors or be such a hypocrite. But really, what this is telling us is that Geshe Ben had very strong mindfulness. And also, this is encouraging us to apply mindfulness to our daily lives. Once you develop mindfulness, what you will recognize is that at all times you're motivated by your self-clinging, by your selfishness. But whether or not Geshe Ben was actually that bad is debatable. By hearing Geshe Ben's story, what we gain is some insight into our own minds and how we can apply mindfulness to our daily lives to help improve ourselves, to keep a check on our kleshas, or our negative emotions. Generally what happens when people start to meditate is that they think they're actually getting worse from their practice. For example, when you first start sitting on your cushion and trying to meditate on the statue of a Buddha, you might start noticing that you're thinking even more than you were before. But in reality, you're not thinking more than you were before. You're just becoming mindful of your thoughts. You're recognizing the amount that you think normally. Through developing mindfulness, what we come to recognize is that we are highly motivated by self-concern, and that we often develop these negative impulses that, if are followed through, will lead to negative consequences. Now, if the negative impulses are very strong, it's easy for us to recognize them. For example, if we get very angry and we want to punch somebody in the face, it's something that we can identify easily, and identifying it, then we're able to apply the remedy and stop ourselves from acting in a very intensely negative way. As you develop mindfulness, what you will come to understand is that there are much more subtle levels of impulse that we have, and that these subtle impulses eventually get us into a lot of trouble. For example, if you're addicted to cigarettes, it is unlikely that you will recognize the initial trigger that causes you to light up another cigarette. Even if you're trying to give up smoking, then there will be these subtle impulses. And because we don't recognize them, then These perpetuate a chain of events that eventually lead to us breaking our promise to give up smoking. And so, by applying mindfulness in your daily life, what you do is you become more acute to your natural way of thinking. And becoming aware of your natural way of thinking, then you're more able to apply the remedies. So as I said yesterday, the Buddha taught there is no other teaching than this. Avoid all negativity. Apply yourself only to virtue, and thoroughly control your mind. And so it is the case. By developing mindfulness, becoming aware of the way you're thinking, then you will be able to do these practices of avoiding negativities and engaging in virtue. So until next time, and see you later.